It was a bitterly cold winter evening when Taylor, Susan, and Jamie began their journey home from school together. The sky was overcast, heavy with rain clouds that wept icy droplets onto the earth below. To avoid the biting winds along the main road, they decided to take a shortcut through the dense woods behind the school. Huddled tightly under a single umbrella, the trio trudged along a narrow path that twisted alongside a crooked stream. The forest seemed alive with unease as twilight descended. A thick mist blanketed the ground, muffling their footsteps and distorting shapes around them. Shadows stretched unnaturally across gnarled tree branches, which clawed at the air like skeletal hands reaching out to snatch unwary travelers. An eerie silence hung over everything, no birds chirped, no leaves rustled. It felt as though nature itself held its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. Suddenly, the girls froze mid-step. Up ahead, crouched beside the edge of the stream, was a figure cloaked in shadow. As they cautiously approached, the horrifying truth revealed itself. It was a woman, her back hunched over as she scrubbed clothes against the rocks in the freezing water. Her ragged gray shawl hung loosely around her shoulders, while long strands of matted black hair obscured her face. But what truly made their blood run cold were the garments she washed. They were soaked crimson, staining the rushing stream red. What is that?" Susan stammered, clutching Taylor's arm. Jamie didn't answer, her wide eyes were glued to the ghastly sight before them. Without another word, the three turned and fled, stumbling blindly through the darkening woods. Branches snagged at their clothes, roots tripped them up, but none dared slow down until they reached the safety of Jamie's house. Gasping for breath, they recounted the terrifying vision to Jamie's mother. "That sounds like the Bean Nye," she whispered gravely after hearing their story. "My grandparents used to tell me about her. She washes the funeral shrouds of those destined to die soon. Seeing her, it's an omen. Does that mean we're going to die?" Jamie asked, her voice trembling. Her mother hesitated. "I don't know. All I can say is, it's bad luck to see her. Back then, people believed she foretold death, but these days, it's just superstition. Maybe it was just some poor soul doing laundry." Despite her reassurances, the girls couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to them like the damp chill seeping through their coats. Taylor decided to head home alone, while Susan opted to stay overnight at Jamie's house for comfort. As night fell, a fierce wind howled outside, rattling windows and shaking the walls of the small house. Heavy snowflakes swirled through the air, coating the world in white. Inside, Susan and Jamie lay awake, too frightened to sleep. Every creak of the floorboards or gust of wind sent shivers down their spines. Morning brought little relief. The entire town was buried under a thick blanket of snow, and schools were closed indefinitely. With Jamie's parents still at work, the two girls found themselves alone. Hoping to distract themselves, they tried calling Taylor, but her phone went straight to voicemail. Unease settled over them like frost on glass. Desperate for answers, they braved the icy trek to Taylor's house. When her mother answered the door, her tear-streaked face told them everything they needed to know. "They found her body this morning," she sobbed, clutching the doorway for support. "In the stream, pieces of her, floating." She broke down completely, unable to finish. Susan and Jamie stumbled back to Jamie's house in stunned silence. Fear gripped them like iron chains. If the legend of the Bean Nye was true, then Taylor's gruesome fate had only been the beginning. Later that evening, the power cut out without warning, plunging the house into pitch darkness. Susan and Jamie huddled together, hearts pounding, listening intently for any sound that might betray an intruder, or worse. Minutes dragged by like hours, but nothing happened. Slowly, the tension eased, replaced by nervous laughter. "I thought for sure she'd come for us," Jamie joked weakly. "Same here," Susan replied, forcing a chuckle. Hunger eventually drove them downstairs to scavenge for food. Armed with candles, they rummaged through the kitchen cupboards and prepared peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. For a brief moment, normalcy returned. But then, Susan choked. At first, Jamie thought she was joking, until she saw the panic in her friend's eyes. Susan clawed at her throat, gasping for air, her face turning an alarming shade of purple. She collapsed to the floor, convulsing violently, before going still. "No! No!" Jamie screamed, dropping to her knees beside Susan's lifeless body. Tears streamed down her face as she realized there was nothing she could do. Wrapping a blanket over her friend's corpse, Jamie grabbed the phone to call for help, but the line was dead. Her mobile showed no signal either. Panic surged through her veins. Trapped in the freezing darkness, Jamie knew she had to act fast. Pulling on her coat, she ventured outside into the blizzard, desperate to find someone, anyone, who could help. Hours later, Jamie staggered back inside, half frozen and barely conscious. Shivering uncontrollably, she searched the medicine cabinet for something to warm her up. In her haste, she grabbed a bottle from the shelf and swallowed its contents without checking the label. Almost immediately, agony tore through her body. Fire burned in her throat, her stomach clenched painfully, and the room spun wildly. Collapsing to the floor, Jamie's blurred vision landed on the bottle in her hand. Through the haze of pain, she read the label, bleach. As consciousness slipped away, Jamie realized the horrifying truth: the Bean Nye hadn't needed to kill her directly. Fate had already sealed her doom. It was a bitterly cold night, the kind where the air felt sharp enough to cut through your very soul. The moon had long since disappeared behind thick, ominous clouds, leaving the world cloaked in an impenetrable darkness. Sister Clarice gripped the steering wheel of her old sedan tightly, her knuckles white from both the chill and the creeping unease that had settled in her chest. She was driving down a desolate country road, flanked by towering trees whose skeletal branches clawed at the sky like desperate hands. The only sounds were the rhythmic hum of her car's engine and the faint crunch of gravel beneath her tires. She glanced nervously at the rosary beads hanging from the rearview mirror, their wooden surface glinting faintly in the dim light of the dashboard. Her lips moved silently as she whispered prayers under her breath, seeking comfort in the familiar words. Midnight Mass was just an hour away, but the late hour and the eerie stillness of the countryside weighed heavily on her mind. As she checked the clock on the dashboard, it blinked ominously, 12 a.m. Exactly midnight. A shiver ran down her spine, not because of the cold, but because something about the number seemed foreboding. Just as she turned her gaze back to the road ahead, her headlights caught something, or someone, standing eerily still in the middle of the deserted highway. Her foot instinctively hovered over the brake pedal, her heart pounding wildly. It was a man, tall and unnervingly thin, his silhouette stark against the pale glow of her headlights. He wore a long, tattered overcoat that billowed slightly in the wind, and a wide-brimmed black hat that cast his face into shadow. His arm was raised, thumb extended in a silent plea for a ride. Sister Clarice hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to keep driving. But then she thought of the Good Samaritan parable, of kindness extended even in the most unlikely circumstances. Who else would stop for this stranger on such a lonely road? Taking a deep breath, she eased her car to the side of the road and rolled down the passenger window. "Do you need a ride?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts to sound calm. The figure stepped closer, revealing a face that made her blood run cold. His skin was deathly pale, almost translucent, and his eyes gleamed with an unnatural intensity. Yet there was something strangely magnetic about him, as though he exuded an aura of quiet authority. He tipped his hat slightly, revealing a faint, enigmatic smile. "I do," he said, his voice smooth and low, carrying a strange resonance that sent goosebumps crawling up her arms. "Where are you headed?" "To the church," she replied, gesturing vaguely toward the horizon. "For midnight mass." "Are you going that way?" He tilted his head thoughtfully, his smile widening ever so slightly. "Close enough," he murmured cryptically before opening the back door and sliding into the seat behind her. The interior of the car seemed to grow colder the moment he entered, though Sister Clarice tried to shake off the sensation as mere paranoia. She resumed driving, the silence between them heavy and oppressive. Determined to break the tension, she began speaking about her faith, about the joy of serving God, the comfort of prayer, and the lessons she'd learned during her years as a nun. To her surprise, the stranger listened intently, occasionally letting out a soft chuckle that sounded almost mocking. Each laugh sent another ripple of unease through her, but she pressed on, hoping to fill the void with the warmth of her beliefs. After what felt like an eternity, the faint outline of the church steeple appeared in the distance, its stained-glass windows glowing softly in the night. Relief washed over Sister Clarice as she realized they were close to their destination. "You can stop here," the man said suddenly, leaning forward in his seat. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made her hesitate. "Are you sure?" she asked, glancing at him in the rearview mirror. "I could take you a little farther." He shook his head, his smile now tinged with something darker. "No, I'll be fine right here. Someone's coming for me. Near this spot." Before she could respond, he opened the door and stepped out into the night. As he stood beside the car, he added, "Thank you, Clarice. For the ride." Her breath hitched. How did you know my name?" she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. But he didn't answer. Instead, he tipped his hat once more and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. Sister Clarice sat frozen for a moment, her mind racing. She hadn't told him her name. No one had. Heart pounding, she got out of the car and followed the path he had taken, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. What she saw next made her blood turn to ice. Where his footsteps should have been, there were no human prints, only the unmistakable marks of cloven hooves, burned faintly into the earth as though branded by fire. Panic surged through her as she scrambled back to the car. Inside, she found something even more horrifying. Etched into the leather of the back seat was a symbol she recognized all too well, the inverted pentagram, a mark associated with evil itself. Terrified, she sped toward the church, her hands shaking on the wheel. When she arrived, she burst through the doors, gasping for breath, and recounted everything to the priest. He listened gravely, his expression growing darker with each word. Together, they inspected the car, confirming the presence of the sinister symbol. But it was too late. The next morning, Sister Clarice was found dead in her car, parked exactly where she had dropped off the mysterious hitchhiker. Her face was frozen in an expression of sheer terror, and the scent of sulfur lingered in the air around her. From that day forward, travelers along that lonely stretch of road swore they could hear faint laughter echoing in the wind, and sometimes, if they dared to look closely, they might catch a glimpse of a tall figure in a black hat, waiting silently by the roadside. It was a quiet evening in a small suburban home. The soft hum of the television filled the living room as an 8-year-old girl sat cross-legged on the couch, her eyes glued to the screen. Her mother sat nearby, flipping through a magazine while occasionally glancing at her daughter. Outside, the wind howled faintly, rattling the windows, but neither paid it much attention. Suddenly, the TV screen flickered violently, startling them both. Static crackled across the display for a brief moment before giving way to something far more unsettling, an image of a ghostly woman dressed entirely in red. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her hollow eyes seemed to pierce through the screen. In her hands, she held a small sign covered in jagged handwriting scrawled in crimson ink. The message read. The mother's heart skipped a beat. She stared at the screen, frozen in disbelief. The words were clear, yet their meaning was anything but comforting. Before she could process what she had just seen, the transmission cut off, and the regular programming resumed as if nothing had happened. Her daughter tugged at her sleeve, wide-eyed. "Mommy, who was that? What did she mean?" "I don't know, sweetheart," the mother replied, trying to mask her growing unease. but I think it's time for you to go to bed." The girl frowned, protesting loudly. "But mommy, my show isn't over yet." The mother hesitated for only a second before her instincts kicked in. Something about that message felt urgent, too real to ignore. With firm resolve, she took her daughter by the hand and led her out of the living room. "Come on, let's get you tucked in," she said gently, though her voice betrayed a hint of urgency. Reluctantly, the girl trudged up the stairs, dragging her feet along the carpet. Once her daughter disappeared into her bedroom, the mother hurried back downstairs to investigate further. When she returned to the living room, the TV screen flickered again. The same ghostly woman reappeared, holding a new sign. This one simply read. Confused but intrigued, the mother sank onto the couch, her pulse quickening. Minutes ticked by in agonizing silence. Nothing else appeared on the screen. No explanation. No follow-up message. Just those two haunting words staring back at her. As the minutes dragged on, impatience began to replace fear. Was this some kind of prank? A technical glitch? She leaned closer to the TV, squinting at the static-filled image, searching for any clue. And then, without warning, the screen changed once more. The woman now held a third sign, its writing cramped and nearly illegible. The mother strained to read it, inching closer until her nose was practically pressed against the glass. Finally, the tiny letters came into focus. A cold wave of dread washed over her. Her blood ran icy, and her breath caught in her throat. For a split second, she couldn't move. Then panic surged through her veins, propelling her toward the staircase. She bolted upstairs, throwing open her daughter's bedroom door. Relief flooded her when she saw the girl lying peacefully in bed, the blankets pulled up to her chin. At first glance, everything seemed normal. But as the mother stepped closer, her relief turned to terror. The blankets weren't rising and falling. There was no sound of breathing. With trembling hands, she reached for the edge of the blanket and pulled it back. What she saw made her scream, a sound so raw and primal it echoed through the house like a banshee's wail. There, on the pillow, lay her daughter's severed head. Her lifeless eyes stared blankly at the ceiling, her lips frozen in a silent cry. The rest of her body was gone, vanished without a trace. Paralyzed by shock, the mother collapsed to her knees, tears streaming down her face. It wasn't until later that night, when the news broke, that she realized the true scale of the horror. More than 500 children across the country had died that night, all under identical circumstances. Every parent who had seen the broadcast described the same ghostly woman in red, the same cryptic messages. Yet no one could explain how the signal had been transmitted or who, or what, was behind it. The police launched an investigation, but all leads ended in dead ends. The mysterious woman holding the sign remained unidentified, and the case was eventually shelved as unsolvable. To this day, parents tell their children to turn off the TV after dark, warning them never to watch alone. Because sometimes, late at night, when the world grows still and shadows stretch long, the screen flickers, and the woman in red appears once more, waiting patiently for her next victims.